You can't go very long or very far in programming without discussions around naming, and that's no different in CDK. Now, CDK using CloudFormation defaults to having the names of resources automatically generated, and they tend to be based off the logical ID as it's seen by CloudFormation. In one of the previous lessons, we looked at how the generated CloudFormation template, so here's an example from earlier, has this name based on the resource or construct and then a hash on the path here. And so you'll often find that the resource name in AWS turns up looking something like this. You know, maybe it's got the stack name prefix to it, but it looks pretty similar. So let's go and have a look at SQS to see that SQS queue. And you can see we've got getting started stack, getting started queue, and then a bit of extra randomness on the end from CDK then CloudFormation. Now, naming things like this has some advantages. The main one being that you can deploy the same stack many, many times without having any conflicts. So for example, if you've got a resource that has to be named uniquely within a particular account and region, if you have a unique name that's auto-generated, and that's always done for you, you're never ever going to run into the problem that you can't deploy two copies, for example, for two pull requests, or if you're having multiple environments in the same account, maybe for staging and production. You might, however, not like the names that get produced by CDK or by CloudFormation. And there are some solutions to that. One of them is to use tagging, and oftentimes tagging gets you a really long way with resources in general. The challenge can be that some AWS user interfaces work differently to others. So this one for SQS queues, for example, we can only search by prefix. It's not a very advanced search. If I go and have a look at Lambda instead, and I click into the search box, you can see we can look by name, description, package type, all tons of things. And we can also actually search by tags. So I could look for everything to do with my getting started stack. And here's our only Lambda function that happens to be for getting started. So depending on what the resource is and where it's used, you may have a better or worse time finding that resource in the console. And again, we have to think, well, why do we want to find it in the console? You know, why are we looking at it from this direction rather than from CDK outwards? And it might be that you're responding to some kind of incident or performing some kind of operational task, and you need to find the right thing to do that. Maybe you need to change the settings on a Lambda function. Maybe you need to alter an alarm. Maybe you need to redrive messages in an SQS queue or similar. And although we, typically try and avoid manual changes to the actual configuration of resources, we might have to do something with it like that queue redriving. We might have to put a hotfix in. And when you're in that scenario, it can be quite tricky to find the right resource if they're all named in this manner. So you see here, only part of this is actually strings that we come up with ourselves. A lot of it is just random data. And the naming here is quite simple because we don't have many nested constructs, but it gets a little bit hairier when we do that, when we have that in there. So it's a bit of a consideration, and you've got to really weigh the trade-offs for your team and context about whether you really care about the names and you want them named a certain way, or whether you don't mind, whether you're going to use tags as a workaround for the auto-generated naming, if tags are easy to find in the services that you use. If we take, for example, a CloudWatch alarm, you might have that integrated with some third-party service. Maybe you use something like PagerDuty to receive on-call notifications. Now, PagerDuty by default won't get the tags that come with the alarm, it just gets the name. So if you don't have anything in there to enrich that data with the tags, all you've got to find the right place in the console and find what's actually going on is the name of the alarm, which could be a load of gibberish. So, it might be easy to read, might not be. And again, it's really about weighing this up for your team, your environment. Another consideration is that if you do name things, you have to come up with some kind of naming scheme, which you hopefully keep aligned with everyone, get everyone on board with, and all naming the same. And also, when you do a replacement type update, you can't do that in CloudFormation if you've specified a name, because CloudFormation says, hey, wait a minute, I can't create a new version of this because the name would conflict. So let's say, for example, you're switching a Lambda function from a zip package to an image. You can't do that without deleting the Lambda function and creating it. And CloudFormation's smart enough to know that. It knows that the Lambda function needs to be recreated to get migrated over. But what CloudFormation does is it creates the new one first and then deletes it. So if there's a problem with creating the new one, it doesn't take away the existing infrastructure that's running there. It leaves it running for you, which is great. However, if you use custom naming, we can't do that. It can't create another version of it with, say, the image package type, because there's already an existing function with that name. It can't put, the number 2 after it or something and then delete it. And it can't delete the old version, then create the new version. It's fixed in its ordering. So you might have to work around that slightly differently. Maybe you would do the change in several stages in maybe an expand and contract style migration. So you deploy a new Lambda function with a new package type and a new name. You switch over to that new Lambda function, and then you remove the existing or the old Lambda function in a new change. And it's about, it's weighing that up. Is that something that you do frequently where you have to have resources recreated? Is that something where it's worth it to you to have custom names, even though you've got to do stuff like that? And, I can't give you the right answer. For me, I tend to default to having the auto-generated name unless it's a really long-lived piece of infrastructure, like something like a database, or like an S3 bucket. And obviously with S3, we have to have naming that works that's globally unique, because the naming is shared with all customers. And so I do tend to name resources like that myself. And I try and work out, I try and trade it off. I try and say, okay, is there an advantage in doing it in this case or not? Same with CloudWatch alarms, for the example I mentioned earlier. If you've got some kind of alerting system that's receiving those and it doesn't really support tags so well, then maybe a custom name is worthwhile. Same for things like those SQS queues. We only have a prefix search with SQS queues, and so it can be quite challenging if you've got hundreds of thousands of them to find the right one, because you can't easily search them with tags in the AWS web UI. But is that relevant for you? I don't know. You have to decide and discuss in your area, in your group, and see what makes sense. I think regardless of your choice about naming, tags are still super, super important, and I really would encourage you to read AWS's guidance on tagging and to come up with a tagging standard for your organization and to roll that out and get some compliance there, because they are super handy anyway, especially for things like trying to allocate costs. So I wouldn't say naming is a replacement for tagging at all. I think either way, whether you're doing the auto-generated naming or custom naming or manual naming, that you should still have the tags in place. If you wanted to know what that custom naming would look like, if we go over to our example application and we've got our node function here, what you'll probably find is that there's a parameter called something like the type of the resource then name. So function name here for our Node.js function there. For role, it's called role name, and we could set those and we could say my test lambda role, and we could call this my test lambda. And then of course that would come through into the console with that name. And if you've got something like an S3 bucket where you're trying to make it unique by the account ID or unique by region, you can always pop this into some string interpolation, and you'll see that WebStorm has replaced my speech marks with backticks there to support that. And we can do AWS in that case. We can get it imported, and we can say AWS.account ID, and then maybe AWS. Come on, autocomplete, you can do it. No, not playing ball today. There we go, we've got it. So although for Lambda functions it doesn't really make sense, not really necessary, because they are named uniquely in each account and region combo, we could do something like that if we wanted, or for an S3 bucket. So that's naming. It's something for you to discuss internally and have a think about. Does it make sense to have auto-generated names, or does it make sense to have custom ones? And please do tagging. Get it right at the start, put it in place. We've got a lesson on it. It really makes a difference. All right, folks.